Hello, everyone, and welcome to Police Off the Cuff, Real Crime Stories. I'm your host, Bill Cannon. I'm a retired NYPD Manhattan North Homicide Sergeant with nearly 27 years. And tonight, I have as a guest, retired NYPD first grade detective, Michael O'Keefe, who's also the author of at least 3 novels and numerous other written works. But tonight we're going to discuss, this is actually part 2 of this series. We're going to discuss the Netflix documentary, The Ripper. And we discussed it in the last time. One of the things that we discussed the last time was that the 2 documentarians, Jesse Vile and Ellen Woods, they wanted you to look at the time and the place where these murders occurred. How people spoke about women and the effect that had on the police investigation, which they clearly felt had a negative connotations, in addition to how journalists reported this case. At this point, I wanted to introduce, this is retired detective Michael O'Keefe. Mike, welcome to the show.
Great to be back, Bill.
It is great. You know, when we look into this case, we both know we've both worked major investigations like this. And when you talk about a serial killer, and we've seen serial killers in New York City, and one of the biggest ones was also around the same time as this, and it was the son of Sam.
Mm-hmm.
And the son of Sam, David Berkowitz, he inflicted terror on an entire city where people, and mostly women, were afraid to go out. They were afraid to go out in their cars. They were afraid to go to nightclubs. They were afraid to walk on the street. They were afraid to walk home. Even back then, the mob, who owned most of the nightclubs, they wanted to find this guy because he was hurting their business.
Yeah.
So the same thing sort of happened. He turned Yorkshire and probably most of England upside down based on the violence and the fear that he inflicted in the population. You want to talk about that, Mike?
Yeah, well, it started off, they were fairly localized, the murders. They were in the Yorkshire area. That particular part of England, kind of in...
Mike, you can see what's up on the screen, right?
Yeah. It's kind of an industrial ruin. It was a depressed area. It was an area that basically London and the higher ends of England kind of shunted to the back. It wasn't very important. They didn't want anything coming out of there to mess their political cover up. But at the same time, they weren't terribly concerned with life as it existed in Yorkshire until this guy got going, and he created such a frenzy of fear that they had no choice but to get involved and to care. And in that respect, there was kind of a class separation there where the well-to-do really didn't care a whole hell of a lot about the everyday existence of the poor. But the documentarians didn't stress the class aspect as much as they did the sexism. And they felt that this took place and was allowed to continue because of an institutional state of sexism and misogyny. And after looking at the documentary, they didn't make their case very strong. It's just,
you know, Mike, one of the things that I would just want to explain to our viewers is that there's something called victim profiling. And there's people that are in certain professions that put themselves at a much higher risk to become the victim of a homicide. And I'm not blaming the victim whatsoever, but if you're working as a prostitute, you have a much higher chance of becoming the victim of a murder than someone that's a housewife, for example. If you're out on the street pitching drugs, you have a much higher chance of becoming a victim of a murder, specifically just because the risk you're putting yourself at. Yeah. So when you compare this to this case where they're saying that the police didn't care because these women were prostitutes, I think, you know, Mike, how many people investigated the first murder?
I had notes on it. I think it was upwards of 175 on the first one. I mean, they called out that specialty squad, and they were going door to door. They searched for evidence, and they kept at it for months at a time. Even without leads, they kept banging on doors. So there wasn't, there might have been some public indifference, but I didn't see any indifference on the part of the police department, because they pretty much put every asset they had into that case.
Yeah, they did. But I mean, I think that, more is not always better. And you know that full well when you work on a homicide. If it's a high profile homicide, they may send 50 detectives. And at some point, they're going to tone it down to maybe a workable number of maybe 10 or 15.
Yeah.
And that you can work better at it. When you have 50 guys there, they can't all be intimately involved in every aspect of the investigation. So they're just going out there taking care of the checklist, basically, the things that must be done. Yeah. And one of the things was that the documentarians complained about also was romanticizing the Ripper. And that was probably done by the press. First of all, calling him the Ripper, also had, intonations of stealing it from a different era, from Jack the Ripper.
Yeah, well, it's Victorian England. It's the ultimate English crime fantasy, but it actually occurred, and a lot of people don't realize Jack the Ripper only did 4 murders.
Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, they were horrendous. They were all prostitutes, and he did rip them. He cut them up, but it was only 4 murders, and it was only over the space of about 2 years.
And this case was actually over the space of a much longer time, even though they counted it as from 1975, and he was finally caught in January of 1981. Right. He actually committed a crime in 1969 that was probably one of the first Ripper type assaults, and the woman who was a prostitute lived, and the police caught him, and they actually let him go.
Right. Yeah. And they had incriminating statements from him. They had, her witness identification. They had the license plate on the van that he fled from. I mean, if nothing else, this should have produced a record that remained a red letter item in his record when you start having prostitute murders that involve having their heads caved in from behind.
Yes.
This girl lived, but that was the MO of this.
Absolutely.
And there were subsequent non-fatal attacks prior to him starting to murder that bore the same MO. And he came to the police attention on those as well. But for whatever reason, when it became a murder pattern, nobody realized to look at him. And he had a record of this type of behavior to begin with. Now, part of the problem, to be fair to the cops at that time, they were a decentralized force. You don't know what the communication was from one department to the next. But the other thing that they didn't have the benefit of, obviously, was computers.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So they weren't able to amass that data in a newfangled way. But I remember when I first came into the Detective Bureau, we didn't have computers either.
Mike, that's funny.
We got information.
No, but it's funny that you said that, because I felt that in the 90s, the NYPD was way behind lots of other departments, because we were still using the DD5 system with typewriters and carbons.
I miss those.
Oh, yeah.
I used to love the smell of them.
Yeah, but the thing is that, that system was so antiquated because you couldn't search, the system in a computer. Like if you're looking for the same perp as someone in the 105 in Queens and you're in the 34, you'll never know that unless you correspond with that detective some way. And how would you know that you're both looking for the same guy?
Right.
How would that pop up? But the complaint system, the DD5 system, once became computerized, you could search it. And if someone else had a perp that they were looking for, or a specific MO or a specific signature, you could search that and find out, wow, look, there's 3 other precincts that have the same problem.
Mm. Well, the first computer system that we were able to avail ourselves of that had any type of search capability was the CARS system.
Right.
And those were, I think, 6 category crimes involving violent crimes, people that were arrested and complaint reports that were in that. So you could actually do searches based upon that. And then from there, the next system that came out was BADS. And that gave you a little bit more ability to search things. But by the time I retired in 2010, everything was automated. Everything was searchable. Everything was on computer.
Yeah, but you know, the systems weren't connected. Like you said, there was CARS, there was BADS, there was gang, you know.
Well, now it's unified, isn't it?
Yes, I think so.
Now they have it unified.
It must be much better. I'd also like to give another message from one of the documentarians, Ellen Woods, who said she wanted to make the story about the women, not about Peter Sutcliffe, who was the Ripper. Mm-hmm. How people speak about women, how people speak about victims. And she blamed the press for demonizing prostitutes. And we spoke about before how you have to assess risk. And what is, you know, what, in this case, you were at risk if you were just a woman walking by yourself. You were at risk.
That really was the nature of this case. While he was attacking primarily prostitutes in the beginning, he started branching out. And by the end of the pattern, he wasn't attacking prostitutes at all. He was just attacking women that weren't attended on the street.
Women in general, yes.
Yeah, women in general. The problem was, and you know, I don't even know if I want to blame the media on it. I blame the police investigators who released all of that information. The investigators need to know that she was engaged in prostitution, because that's going to put you in certain environments to look for your criminal, because that's where he's going to show up.
Right.
The media doesn't need to know about that. And they should have never been told. It should have just been mother of 4 out on her own. They can make their own inferences based upon the time,
yes,
and where she was coming from. But to categorize them as prostitutes did not help your case at all. If anything, there was public apathy once you labeled them as prostitutes.
No, absolutely. And the thing is that we discussed this off camera, that had we known say this happened in New York City, we would definitely get some undercovers. Even if you had to have a man dress up as a woman and dress up as a prostitute to ensnare this guy in, which is done in New York City. We have undercovers do that.
We've also had female undercovers forever. I mean, if you remember Muggable Mary.
Yes, yeah.
No reason for a guy to dress up. We got plenty of brave female detectives.
Absolutely. So, and I don't think that occurred to them back then to do like an undercover operation.
They were checking cars, which was okay. It's good. I mean, doing more research into the case, the documentarians weren't great about detailing everything that they tried. They were checking cars, and that was a key tactic, but they really weren't as deep into it or as thorough with it as they should have been.
Yes.
And there should have been some undercover presence on the street that never really occurred.
For sure. You know, Mike, I wanted to talk about, because this is a serial killer, we want to talk about organized and disorganized offenders. And I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs on what organized and disorganized offenders are and how it affected this case. According to the offender and crime scene dichotomy, organized crimes are premeditated and carefully planned, so little evidence is normally found at the scene. Organized criminals, according to the classification scheme, are antisocial, often psychopathic, but know right from wrong, are not insane, and show no remorse. Based on historical patterns, organized killers are likely to be above average intelligence, attractive, married or living with a domestic partner, employed, educated, skilled, orderly, cunning, and controlled. They have some degree of social grace, may even be charming, and often talk and seduce their victims into being captured. This guy showed a lot of those traits Yet he showed some traits of a disorganized offender also.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it sounded like you were describing Peter Sutcliffe when you were reading that paragraph. But then there are elements within each crime you can see where he kind of he kind of split from the script, and he engaged in some disordered behavior at the crime scenes.
Yeah, like, the number
An
one
example was going back.
Yes, yes.
And revisiting his victims.
Well, that's like a sexual thing too, is like sometimes a serial killer will go back to the scene of a crime just to relive the feeling of the kill all over again.
Yeah.
And that's sometimes in serial cases, investigators will actually, conduct surveillance at the scene to see who comes by. I mean, it's a 1 in a million shot, but it can happen. And I don't know if Peter Sutcliffe, another thing that serial killers usually do is they take souvenirs or trophies with them. And that's another way they relive the crime. They get like a sexual jolly out of it, to relive the crime.
Well, what he was doing, and it might have served the purpose of the trophy, is he kept his weapons. The weapons were never found at the scene.
Right.
He knew what was used based upon the pathological evidence. But when they actually did a search warrant of his car and his house, that's when they recovered the tools. And he pretty much had every he owned a dozen ball-peen hammers. I mean,
yeah, that was his tool of choice to render the victim unconscious.
And he was using the round side because he was leaving perfect round holes in the back of their skulls. So
that's crazy.
Very particular crime.
Mike, that's also a part of a disorganized offender is the blitz style of attack.
Right.
An overwhelming, attack on the victim. But in fact, some of them survived these blitz style attacks.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the first victim. A Wilma McCann, age 28, had 4 children. You want to speak about that, Mike?
Well, she was characterized immediately as a prostitute, and clearly her behavior was consistent with someone who would be involved in prostitution. But I don't know if they ever really established that she was a prostitute.
Right.
Based upon her son's description of their life when he was a child in the house, it stands to reason she was probably engaged in prostitution just for the economic need of it.
Right. Well, England, Mike, England at that time had some really bad economic times.
Oh, post-war England up through the 60s and 70s was a horror show.
Yeah.
Economically.
So some people just resorted to prostitution because there
wasn't anything else.
Yeah, there was nothing else. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But that particular case with Wilma's found in a field a couple hundred yards away from our house, behind our house, the housing project that she lived in. They call it council housing. It's low-rise projects.
Right.
She's got blunt trauma, 2 perfect round wounds in the back of her head, and now the stab wounds. Now, while everything looks ordered, including the staging of her body, the rest of the attack looks to have elements of disorder in it. With respect to the stab wounds, she stabbed twice in each breast. Her abdomen is torn open. There's a slashing wound in her abdomen, and the medical examiner actually said you could tell from the wounds and the round object that was used to stab her that this person was taking the time to drive the weapon deeply in and swirl it around to see the effect that it had.
Oh my God.
So there's a curiosity there that leads you to believe, okay, we're kind of going around the bend to a disordered killer here.
Yeah.
But the rest of his behavior throughout the crime means he gave it some thought.
He stabbed her 15 times in the neck, chest, and abdomen. And
was this Wilma? I thought Wilma was only stabbed the 3 times.
No, according to my notes, she was stabbed 15 times in the neck, chest, and abdomen. And
Okay.
this was the case where they were assigned 150 police officers and 11,000 interviews were conducted to find,
Right.
as the start of this investigation.
And
So to say that,
the other element of it is that the police characterized it as a non-sexual crime, yet semen was found on the back of her underwear.
right. So can you imagine, like today, that would have been the smoking gun that would catch the perpetrator in
Yeah, there
homicide?
wouldn't be a second attack.
Right. There would not be exactly that, And also, as we discussed in the first show, is that when you use an edged weapon, you usually cut yourself at some point because it's such a violent interaction between the perpetrator and the victim. And then if you cut yourself, you're going to leave blood on the scene. And again, today, DNA would be recovered on the scene.
Right.
The second victim is a woman. Her name is Emily Jackson. He stabbed her 52 times.
Yeah.
She was in dire financial straits, and she'd been using the family van to exchange sexual favors for money. So she was working as
with
a
her husband's
prostitute.
blessing.
Yeah, exactly. When I read that, it was a little crazy.
Yeah.
Sutcliffe hit her in the head with a hammer, then dragged her body into a rubbish-strewn yard and used a sharpened screwdriver to stab her in the neck, chest, and abdomen. Sutcliffe stamped on her thigh, leaving an impression of his boot. We spoke about that.
Yeah.
So, that's a class characteristic because I think they did actually identify the type of boot it was. And then if they could have got those boots and they collected the evidence good enough, they could have got an individual characteristics should have possibly identified.
The boot shows up. It starts to show up with the second murder, but it continues to show up intermittently in the other attacks. But what's interesting is, as much as the stabbing and the blunt force trauma appear to be disordered characteristics, he very clearly stages the body. He leaves it in such a way that sticking out from the alley, the thing you see are her feet and her legs splayed open, and you can't miss the fact that there's a woman laying on her back with her legs spread at the end of the alley.
Right.
So
right.
he was trying to get people to find his kill.
But that's also if you speak to any psychologist, that's a big indicator of a sexual related crime, a sexual related homicide.
Right. Well, the other thing that psychologists and psychiatrists have figured out is, for some people, the thrill of violence is no different chemically in the body as the thrill of sex, and violence actually in many cases supplants the sex act.
Right.
They get more gratification from it. So it's just because you don't have any elements of a sex crime on the victim doesn't mean it wasn't sexual in nature.
No, absolutely not. I just want to find a that's the first
son,
victim. Yeah, that's Wilma McCann, who was only 28 years old, but she had 4 kids. And in this documentary, they interviewed, that's her son.
Right.
They interviewed him in regards to what occurred. The kids were like, I think there was 4 kids like less than 5 years old when she was murdered.
Yeah, and I read actually one of the daughters, because of this, actually took her own life later on. Like, she could never cope with what had occurred to her mother.
Yeah, I mean, this guy, besides the people he killed, he destroyed hundreds and hundreds of lives, of the victims' families, and just even people that were terrified of him just because of the reign of terror he ran over 5 years in this Yorkshire area.
Yeah, you don't know how many personal decisions were affected by his behavior or the threat that he posed.
The third victim is an Irene Richardson. She was also 28 years old. February. So he did, his attacks were done in October, and then he did one in January, and he did one in February. But this one was the one in January is 1976. The February one is 1977. So we're talking about almost 13 months apart. And Miss Richardson was a Chapeltown sex worker.
Right.
And she was bludgeoned to death with a hammer. Tire tracks near the murder scene resulted in a long list of possible suspect vehicles. And we know that the perpetrator drove a truck. So his tire tracks were also an identifier, possibly,
Right.
they could have put together.
Right. But he also drove cars. And I believe the tire tracks they came up with weren't truck tires. They were from a car.
From a car, okay.
And oddly enough, when he was finally arrested at the end of the pattern, when the uniformed cops finally grabbed him before he was able to kill the last prostitute, those tires actually matched the tire tracks that were found on the crime scenes.
Which is such strong evidence in a court of law.
Forensically, I mean, you're at the scene. It's the only tire track. You're the only one there.
Right.
It's
very, very powerful evidence. Let's move on to the next one.
Yeah.
Patricia Atkinson, 32 years old. She was also a sex worker from Bradford. He murdered her in her own apartment where police found a footprint on her bedclothes. So that's the second time we have a footprint.
Yeah.
So
and also on the linoleum and carpeting. All right, he left bloody footprints, and the pathologist looking at the crime scene said that it was clear from the bloody footprints and the very clear boot prints, by the way, in those blood footprints, that he left, got to the door, regarded the scene, and then came back and adjusted the body because he wanted it to look a certain way. So,
That's
which
great.
is, which is the earmarks of an ordered psychopath.
Yeah, absolutely. The thing is, I wonder how back in 1975 in England, how did they document a bloody footprint or a footprint on the bed? You've been to scenes, and I've been to scenes where you'd have emergency service come in, and if it was on the floor, they'd actually saw the floor out and take the whole print on the piece of wood with them.
Yeah.
And then they would take that to a forensic lab and they'd reproduce either photographic or reproduce the print the way crime scene guys do.
Yeah.
But I wonder how they did it back then.
It had to just be photo analysis, but they were they were able to very clearly match the footprints, the bloody footprints, with the boot print that came off of Emily Jackson's thigh.
Yes.
It was the same boot print.
Right. And this one was on her bedclothes. Let's move on to Jane McDonald, 16. On June 26, 1977, Sutcliffe murdered 16-year-old Jane McDonald in Chapeltown. She was not a sex worker, which made locals concerned that the Ripper would attack any women. Her body was found at an adventure playground in Reginald Street, Leeds. Is this what wasn't when he killed a non-prostitute? Didn't they want to discount it somehow?
Originally, they did all sorts of mental jujitsu in light of this. First of all, Jane McDonald at 16 is a child. Never mind that she's not a sex worker. She's a child.
Yes.
Where she was found is not where she was grabbed. There was clear indication that he had dragged the body to stage it in the playground, which kind of suggests a pseudo-psychological sticking it to society that not only am I murdering children, I'm putting them in their playground for you to find. So it's almost like a cat and mouse. However, the lead investigators had so bought into the idea that he hated prostitutes that they suggested that he thought she was a prostitute, that he mistook her for a prostitute.
Right.
Ridiculous.
Yeah. Ridiculous.
He did not. If he did, he's the stupidest man in the world.
Well, Mike, one of the things we also found out through reading about this case and not from watching the documentary was that Peter Sutcliffe liked to hang out in the prostitution areas and the bars right around the prostitutes. And he had sex with some prostitutes that he didn't kill prior to going on this, serial killing spree.
Yeah, well, his first attack, and the victim lived back in 1969. he had actually, I don't know if he got his pocket picked, but in any event, he got rolled for 10 pounds by a prostitute, and he was out with his friend looking for that prostitute when he came upon the one that he attacked. And he claimed, we don't know because it was never recovered, it was never fully investigated, but he claimed that he hit her with a rock and a sock.
Right.
And but it could have been a hammer. Nobody looked at it.
Right, because
police
there was
had him in custody. They had incriminating statements. They had an identification from the victim who was a prostitute, but not the prostitute who had robbed him. And it got squashed because she didn't want to press charges.
Right, they let him go.
There was still the record of the arrest, but
right. That was in
no
1969, a full 6 years before the murder started occurring.
Yeah, but from what we've come to understand, when they finally arrested him and they put everything together and they put their biases away and they went through everything and found old cases and actually sat down and confronted him with them. He admitted that he had done them. There were a lot of non-fatal attacks prior to him killing. He
Absolutely.
worked his way up to murder.
Yes.
Which is, knowing what you know about serial killers, it's, you know, when you learn to ride a bike, you're not jumping on the racing bike right away. You got to work your way up from the tricycle to the training wheels to the sissy bar.
No, absolutely.
Now you're on your racing bike. It's a gradual thing. You know, you're not Jack the Ripper on your first couple ones out of the barn.
No, not at all.
Getting a feel for this, and I think what it is he was building his fantasy and building to the point where he needed the murders now to complete the fantasy, and that's when it became a murder pattern.
You know, Mike, I just want to shout out to some of our live chatters. MC's audio, thank you for showing up. Bugsy Cruiser, Earthkeeper, thank you. Jane Coac Triboletti, thank you from Southern New Hampshire. Hello, Southern New Hampshire. Ryan, Investigative Group, one of our biggest fans.
Bill Ryan.
Jane Coac Triboletti, Earthkeeper, Ben Miller. Thank you all for listening. We're very happy that you're here. The other thing, when you spoke about, you're right. There was at least, I think, eight more attacks that were never reported, besides the 7 that did get reported of women that survived.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's probably also to do with the fact that, you know, I think you told me a story before where someone came in to report it to the police and they just threw her out of the precinct, basically.
Yeah, that was, trying to remember her name. She could have put this thing to bed. I think she was actually attacked shortly after the first murder.
Mm-hmm.
And it was only when it became a pattern, and it was actually after Jane McDonald was killed, that it was a big news thing now, because it wasn't a prostitute. It clearly wasn't just prostitutes. It involved every woman in England who was vulnerable. So she realizes this, and now, because all the information is going into the paper and the description of the crimes and the perpetrator, she realizes this is the guy that attacked me. And she went into the police station to tell them, I'm sure that the guy that attacked me is the guy who's doing these murders. And they laughed at her and they threw her out.
That's unbelievable, you know. All right, let's go. There's another one. October 1st, 1977, Sutcliffe murdered Jean Jordan, a sex worker from Manchester. In a later confession, Sutcliffe said he realized that he gave her a new £5 note. And after he killed her, he went back to retrieve it because he felt that the police might be able to trace this brand new £5 note.
And he was right, but he didn't. When he went back to get the note, he didn't find it. It was secreted in a side pocket in the purse. So the police did end up getting that note, and they were able to trace it to a great extent. That actually brought them to interview Sutcliffe. So there was a path that the evidence took them.
Right.
To the correct guy.
they interviewed 5,000 people in regards to that £5 note,
Yeah.
and he was one of them.
But that crime scene differed from the others in that there was extraordinary mutilation. He introduced fire to it, actually burned her hair off, smashed her face in, and cut her breasts off, which is different than the extent of the mutilation in the other bodies. And everything, her clothing, all the items in her purse were scattered all over the place, giving the impression that this was a disordered murder. But it's only when he went back the second time that he did all of that.
Right.
He had actually staged the body previous to that with just the head injuries and some stab wounds.
Right. So as I said before, Sutcliffe exhibited traits of an organized and a disorganized offender.
Yeah, he definitely had some rage issues.
Yes, big time. I mean, the mutilation and the sexual mutilation of some of these bodies, I think psychiatrists or psychologists would have a field day with this guy's brain, you know?
Yeah.
Crazy. And then on October 9th, 1977, there was Gene Jordan, who was discovered by a local dairy worker and future actor Bruce Jones.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, that's the one we're talking about. With
That's the one we're talking about.
The
yeah.
£5 note. The next one was an Yvonne Pearson, age 21. She was a 20-year-old prostitute from Bradford who was murdered by Sutcliffe on January 21st, 1978. He repeatedly bludgeoned her across the head with a ball-peen hammer.
But prior to that, there was a survivor, Marilyn Moore,
Mm-hmm.
who was a confirmed prostitute. She had been hit in the head 3 times. The tire tracks matched from the previous crime scenes. And she was the one who was able to give them a detailed sketch, which, for whatever reason, as far as I can see from what I've read and what I saw in the documentary, they never really did much with the sketch. I know the investigators had it, but I don't think they ever got that out to the media and got it out to the public.
Yeah, according to my notes, it says that Moore provided one of the best photo fits of Sutcliffe. I guess that's what they call it in England. A sketch, a photo fit. I love some of their language.
And interestingly enough, when they finally do grab Sutcliffe, he's a dead ringer.
Right.
It's a fantastic job.
Well, some of his co-workers called him the Ripper because he looked so much like the sketch.
Well, that and the fact that the police had been talking to him after every murder.
He was
been interviewing intermittently as these were going on. They had spoken to him.
He was brought in a total of 9 times.
But yeah, by the time that it ended, there was 9 times that he was interviewed for these crimes, and for whatever reason, and usually it was because they had locked into the idea that the guy had a Geordie accent and wrote the letters and sent the tape.
Yeah, they had that right. The letters were let me just give it a look.
They were a red herring.
Yes, I think we might have a copy of. They actually posted that on a billboard.
Yeah.
A copy of his handwriting, and they also had the tape was put out everywhere on television so everyone could listen to it.
Yeah, they were playing it constantly, and that caused the main investigators. Actually, they weren't even investigators; they called them detectives, but they were the bosses. They were the administrators that ran the case. Some of the detectives on the field, as a matter of fact, one of the first times that Sutcliffe was interviewed, the detective that actually interviewed him didn't like his answers.
Right.
And got a bad feeling about him and thought that he fit the description perfectly. The only difference was he had a Yorkshire accent, which if they had listened to the girl that lived, you had a picture up before.
The girl that survived. Yes. Hang on a second.
Yeah, the 15-year-old.
I think that's her right there.
Yeah, that's her. If they had listened to her, and it's one of the reasons why they discounted her case that it wasn't the Ripper, she said very clearly, he's from around here. That's a Yorkshire accent. And when the detective actually took it to the head investigator, Oldfield,
yes,
yelled at him, threw him out of the office, told him if anybody tells me that the guy looks like the sketch and he doesn't have a Geordie accent, you'll be doing the rest of your career in traffic.
Crazy. I want to shout out to Rebecca Hicks from Wisconsin and Melody McAtee from Indiana. Welcome to Real Crime Stories.
Midwest is in the house.
Midwest, it's cold there. We have a little cold here in New York, but not like out there, you know.
No, they have real winters there.
That's right. So part of this investigation was because it was a massive undertaking with a lot of lack of technology. And there was some really glaring investigative snafus, some glaring mistakes that allowed this guy to wreak havoc for over 5 years and to kill 13 women and to attack another at least 7 and probably a lot more than that.
Yeah.
When you think about an investigation like this, serial killers are very rare these days. And one of the reasons is because they usually get caught early enough that they don't become serial, and one of the reasons is because of the technology we have, DNA, cell phones, video cameras, computers, all of those things help us to capture, track, trace serial killers so they never get to do as many as they could do in another era.
Well, nowadays society, everybody has a cell phone. Society has self-imposed a GPS tracker on themselves.
Absolutely. But, the thing is, getting back to the premise of the documentarians, that this whole case was predicated upon the fact that how women were treated, how people spoke about women, how people spoke about poor people. And what we know, Mike, is because we worked for years in poor neighborhoods, that there is much more violence in poor neighborhoods. And that just happens to be a fact of life.
Well, dysfunctional life promotes dysfunctional behavior. It's kind of common sense.
Absolutely. So but it was also, their premise that the prostitutes were demonized. And I think we addressed that before, that
I don't think that they were demonized. I do believe that the media themselves minimalize their importance with respect to reporting the stories. But that's the media. They're selling newspapers. It doesn't affect the police work.
Right.
Unless you're giving them all your information, and now you have nothing to hold back for you, for the perp. There actually was a great quote from one of the reporters early on in the pattern. He referred to these murders as fish and chip murders. They were today's news, but you're going to wrap the fish at the fish and chips the next day in it. So, if the head crime reporter in the biggest newspaper in that part of England is referring to a woman's murder as a fish and chip murder, obviously he doesn't consider her life very significant. But the detective spent a lot of time, money, and effort to try to solve it. So they weren't in agreement with the media.
No, they certainly did. There was a lot of time and effort, but there was a lot of, I would say, not great investigative work from the top, not the boots on the ground.
Well, that largely was the problem. You really can't centralize an investigation like this the way that they did.
Right.
There was no communication between the head and the hands doing the work. The fact of the matter is, the documentarians refer to them as detective inspectors.
Right.
Yeah, but they weren't detectives.
No, they weren't.
They were police administrators.
Right.
You look great with the scrambled eggs on your hat and the stars on your shoulder, but you're not going to find the bad guy. That's going to be me down here in the dirt.
Right.
Not you in your office.
Ultimately, the way he was caught was, and when I watched some of the reporters that are reporting on this now, when they said, "Oh, they just
they called it luck."
Yeah, they luckily made the arrest. No, that's not called luck.
No, was the soul of police work.
Yes, that's called good police work. It's called observation, making a cause stop, questioning, searching, bringing the person in, interrogating. That's good police work.
Yeah.
So, yes, I would agree there was some poor police work, but when good police work happens, at least acknowledge that, you know?
Yeah, no, they want to chalk it up to chill. They got lucky. No, they didn't get lucky. They did their
Right.
job.
Well, it's just like, you know, when we compare a serial killer like in New York City, the son of Sam, and there was a huge task force to capture him.
Hmm.
And one of the ways he was caught was a summons was written on his car. And the police officer that wrote that summons got promoted to detective for writing that summons.
Interestingly enough, though, the full story on that is him and his partner wrote that summons that night and then swung out without putting it into the bin.
Oh, wow.
So it was in the locker. The detectives, and it was, I forget the lead detective, Eddie, I should never forget his name because he was a legend on this job.
Yeah.
But they went and interviewed the woman who watched them actually summons the car.
Uh-huh.
And she was suspicious of the car. So now they went back to the local precinct looking for this summons. It's not in the box. And they try and find that. They look at the roll call and they see who had it. They call the cop at home. He's like, yeah, it's in my locker. Like, well, you better get your ass in here and get it. The detectives need it. So that's how they ended up getting the summons. The detectives knew about the existence of the summons before it was handed in.
Wow.
So
I remember there was a detective.
You know who tells that story, actually, because his father was one of the bosses on the task force, was Charlie Dowd. I don't know if you remember him. He was actually my zone captain that put me in for second grade.
No kidding.
Brooklyn North, yeah.
We had a Lieutenant Dowd in the 2-4. I don't know if they were related.
Different guy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Charlie ended up retiring as a chief. He had communications.
You know, it's just like there was a detective in the 2-3 who was actually still there, and he's a great detective, but he would always take notes and not do his DD5s, and he'd spend one whole day just typing.
Yeah.
And then, but the thing was, we had this case that was really important. We had to bring him in from home just to type.
His
it reminds me of that, you know?
Yeah. Well, there was a time when I first got into the detective bureau and we were still doing the pink and the blue 5s, the carbons. You didn't do your 5s until he was in the box.
Right.
And then you sat there on overtime typing all your 5s. You were working out of that steno pad.
I just wanted to give a shout out to some more of our live chatters. Joey Brooklyn, what's up? Le Marie Vlog, Robert 123. Yeah, you know me. Rebecca Hicks. No, I haven't actually seen the most recent interview with Chief Walker. I did. I'm sorry. I did watch it. We did a show last night with Duty Ron and we addressed that. We're pretty much running out of time. So I think I'm going to sum up Real Crime episode number 2, part 2 with retired first grade detective Michael O'Keefe. And one of the reasons we wanted to address this, we both watched that Netflix documentary on the Ripper, and it seemed like the documentary people were applying today's standards to a 1975 case. And I don't agree with their premise that this case was messed up because of the way they felt towards women and the way that they felt towards poor people. I just felt that there was some bad investigative work in this case, and there was a lot of mistakes made, and also the technology prevented them from doing a better job in this case. What's your feelings, Mike? Final thoughts?
Yeah, I'm with you. Classism, sexism, and misogyny had nothing to do with it. It did not promote additional murders. It was a matter of a poorly organized and conducted investigation that prevented the detectives from basically using the evidence that they had already gotten.
Right.
It just, they were on the right track. They knew what they were looking for. They continued to look for it. I just don't think that they were using the best and most economical means to examine what it was that they were trying to examine.
Right.
And part of it, maybe the people that were in charge of the investigation didn't have that kind of street experience. The other part is This was the first, other than Jack the Ripper, 100 years before, in the 1880s. England didn't have these kind of crimes. So
Yeah,
they were kind of learning as they went.
Yeah, I think, I don't know, it just bothers me when someone goes into a documentary and states a premise when they really don't know a lot about investigation.
Yeah, well, but basically the documentarians had their premise, and everything they did with respect to making the film, they used to try and justify that premise.
Yes, I
however,
agree.
having watched the whole thing, they failed to make their argument.
I agree. I agree. But something, maybe they should have questioned some people that had done major investigations before. When they talk about classism, classism, most violent crimes are done in poorer neighborhoods. I'm sorry if you didn't learn that at where you went to college, but that happens to be, the police don't pick the neighborhoods where the violent crimes happen.
This was a prime example of that. This is a poor to working class working man who, with some serious psychological issues, living in this poor area, victimizing women from the same socioeconomic and racial class as he.
Right.
There's no difference. They had the same, basically living the same lives in the same area. So classism doesn't fit. And with respect to most of the detectives that worked on this case, with the exception of the big superintendents, these were local people who were the police.
Right.
That's who was doing the hard work on the street to try and figure out who this guy was.
But they even pointed,
and it was those local working class cops who were basically thwarted by the bosses having a preconception of who the bad guy was.
Right. Exactly.
They wouldn't accept looking at the evidence to form a new opinion that would have focused on such.
But Mike, the documentarians even pointed at the fact that the police told women not to go out, not to be by themselves. Like, hello, this guy, the Ripper, is killing women.
Yeah, and the thing is, the police weren't telling them not to go out. They were suggesting they don't go out.
Right.
That's called good advice.
And if they do go out,
to protect you from yourself.
Right. If you do go out, don't walk alone. Have someone walking with you.
Go out in groups.
Yeah.
Now it's a party. Enjoy yourselves.
Well, Mike, I think we've hit we actually hit almost 55 minutes. So I think it's time to say, do you want to say anything? You want to plug anything? You got a new book coming out?
If you like good crime fiction based on real cases, check me out at michaelokeefeauthor.com. There's links to my Amazon page where you can buy the books, and look for my next offering in the Patty Durst series, probably coming out late spring.
That's a great book. That's a great book, man. I read all your books so far.
Well, the follow-up is actually the third in the Patty Durst series, Detective Patty Durst series. It's going to be titled Burnt to a Crisp, and it's based on one of my old homicide cases, a arson triple homicide. That's
great. Joey Brooklyn, thank you so much for that super chat, and thank you so much for listening. So this was another episode of Police Off the Cuff / Real Crime Stories, episode number 2, part 2 on the Yorkshire Ripper serial killer. I'm Bill Cannon, and I want to just thank Michael O'Keefe for critiquing this case with me. Thanks again, Mike.
Pleasure to be here. It was fun as always.
All right. Good night, everyone.